Hello everyone, our text for today is An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. Let's begin. Okay, so what is capitalism? In an earlier video, I went through capitalism and socialism, and I'll put the link somewhere for you so you can go back to that one. So just to recap, capitalism is an economic system where things are owned by people or an individual, and where people have to work for money. People may sell or lend their property, and other people may buy or borrow them. If one person wants to buy and another person wants to sell to them, they do not need to get permission from higher power. It has the view that if you work hard, you will be rewarded. Everyone should pay their own taxes. The poor should work harder to earn more. And traditionally, it was represented through the Conservative Party and especially through Winston Churchill. Socialism, on the other hand, in theory, this system results in the divide between classes getting smaller, with the poorest of a nation's people getting better taken care of, while the richest make sacrifices in terms of higher taxes and regulation of business, where people work together to gain a fair standard of living. So this system really promotes the idea of people working together and having shared responsibility. Traditional views of the Labour Party, so this was traditionally associated with the Labour Party being, the idea of being a socialist. We know that Priestley he supports this idea, Bernard Shaw as well, and H.G. Wells. There is the view of living together and looking out for each other, and this also lends to people sharing their wealth. There's equal access for all resources, and the extreme of this would be where an authority enforces sharing of wealth and does not allow people to own things. And that is communism and not socialism. But the two are sometimes confused, and they shouldn't be. So today we're specifically looking at structure in Act 1. Our learning objective is to be able to analyze and understand the timing of the inspector's arrival in Act 1. So essentially, we are looking at why his timing is so important, and why does Priestley allow the inspector to enter at this specific time. To begin unpicking this, we're going to be looking at Mr. Berlin's speech in that act, a bit of it. So it says, "But this is the point. I don't want to lecture you two young fellas again. But what so many of you don't seem to understand now, when things are so much easier, is that a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too, of course, when he has one. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. But the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters. And I've learned in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. And then we hear the sharp ring of a front door bell, and Berlin stops to listen. This is the point that Inspector Gould arrives. And I want you to really focus on the things that Mr. Berlin was saying before Inspector Gould's arrival. Now, Berlin epitomizes capitalism in every way. And so when he arrives at this point, and most of the things that he was saying, you need to look out for yourself, your own interests, only look out for your family, are really tenets of capitalism, being individualistic, making money for yourself, trying to get as much money as possible. And then Inspector Gould arrives at that precise point. I would like you to focus on this extract, and we're going to be discussing some questions now surrounding this extract. So now let's look at the question. The first question says, what does Mr. Berlin believe in? Does he believe in capitalism or socialism? And look back at the definitions of both. Number 2, what evidence is there in the extract to suggest he believes this? And you can write those down. Number 3, how do you think a modern day audience would feel about Mr. Berlin and his beliefs? Number 4, how do you think a 1940s audience would have felt about the character of Mr. Berlin and his beliefs, and why? And number 5, how do you think the contemporary people would have felt about Mr. Berlin and his beliefs, and why? So the working class audience living at the same time as Mr. Berlin, middle class audience living at the same time as Mr. Berlin, and upper class audience living at the same time as Mr. Berlin. Please write your answers in the comments below. Okay, so let us just recap and see what have we learned and check some of the answers that you've put down. So Mr. Berlin believes in capitalism, and he says this in the extract when he talks about, being responsible for yourself. So he doesn't talk about a shared responsibility at all. Earlier in the play, he talks about higher costs for lower wages. So making the prices very, very high, but paying the minimum amount. All of these views are associated with capitalism. Then a lower class audience, what would they feel? And specifically when he talks about, so he says, I don't want to lecture you two young fellas again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand now, when things are so much easier, is that a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family. Of course, when he has one, and so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. So that idea about, looking after yourself, and you're only responsible for yourself. And then he says, but the way some of these cranks talk and right now, you think everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. So of course the lower class, who would be suffering and struggling at this point, would have a negative view of what Mr. Berlin is saying. Because, if you have much, and they say, to whom much is given, much is required. You do have a responsibility to look out for others. It can't be that you just gain all the money and it's just yourself. You don't, and you would pay the same amount of taxes as someone who doesn't have any money. That seems not fair. It doesn't seem to be a fair way of doing stuff. So yes, and a middle class audience who would be in a better situation, but would still maybe have a a more shared responsibility. So they would be thinking, maybe this is not at this point where a lot of people were really trying to change. Remember, at this point, a lot of change was happening, and people were really thinking about how to change the status of what was happening at the time. A higher class, however, I would think a higher class audience, a lot of them would feel like we need to secure our wealth. We need to really keep our wealth, as Mr. Berlin, as the upper class at that time, they have the resources to live in a certain way. If you notice at the beginning, Mr. Berlin has a servant, he has a maid, they're drinking port. To how do you maintain this? What would a modern audience feel? A modern audience, as in our time, would definitely, because when you talk about your alternative interpretations, and when you talk about how would a modern day audience feel, it could be today. So you would start with a phrase like, today the audience would believe that this was what? Unfair and not equal. So you could talk about all of that, what is happening today. And definitely Priestley's message is about embracing socialism, and that socialism is more acceptable than capitalism. Of course, the audience would be shocked as well by some of the things that Berlin is coming out with. They've just gone through the war and all of those happening, the war, and he's saying all of these things. It would be shocking, and that's why Priestley's message does resonate with the audience. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.